What's up, guys? I'm the Wiggle Man, and welcome to my new channel, Loot Hoarder. This is my new channel, dedicated to painting up 3D printed props, busts, and even miniatures. I'd like to use this channel to document and share my own painting process, but also to grow myself and others along the way, just to make some damn good looking stuff. For this first video, we're going to be painting up the Luthumos, Lord of the Death Mask. It's currently, it's available from lootstudios.com, and it was a release in their June Fantasy Bundle and their June to July Sci-Fi Bundles, which we've just finished now. So let's get down to the model. To begin with I primed the model with a yellow primer as I was fool enough to print the model out in a grey Elegoo water washable grey, which also pretty much exactly colour matches my grey primer that I'm using. But also the yellow tone, it adds a good foundation for the bony kind of colours on the mask and give it that little extra oomph. I do find it easy to discount that if primer actually affects the end product or not, but I think in this case I made the right call. I then took my airbrush and added some shadows in with Vallejo Model Black. I was aiming from the bottom of the model to the top, just to darken down the areas that naturally be shaded when the mask is lit from above. Once I was happy with the shading, I then took Vallejo Model Air Light Brown and began to do the opposite. So I'd start applying my highlights, so shooting from top onto the top of the mask. So within just a couple of minutes of airbrushing, we've got a good solid set of shadows, base coat and highlights. They all interplay well with each other on the model, and it really helps to bring out the shapes, the texture, the detail on the model. Next up, I start to hit the model with a Satin Varnish. The glossiness of the varnish at this stage doesn't really matter, as at a later stage we're going to be dulling down that glossy coat. This is just to protect the foundations that we've already laid down for something we're going to be doing in the future. So we're doing a bit of legwork for something that will pay off a bit better later on. Once the varnish coat had all dried, I decided to paint the teeth in more of a lighter cream, off-white kind of a colour. I used Citadel's Screaming Skull. If you look at photos of skulls, usually the enamel of the teeth will be much whiter than the bone on the rest of the skull. So when painting, I made sure to kind of just leave the recesses in the gaps of the teeth, just to give some more depth from the foundation that we'd already layered down. It took me about 3 coats to get a nice, solid, smooth, toothy white colour. Now, this is where the fun begins. A lot of people like to call Agrax Earthshade cheating in a bottle. Well, here I'm going to be using AK Interactive's Rust Streak effect. If Agrax Earthshade is cheating in a bottle, then this is insider trading in a bottle. Rust Streaks is an enamel-based wash. It can be painted on or ran through an airbrush. It's got a nice, warm, kind of burnt umber tone to it. So I apply that through my airbrush, just again going into the shadows, going into the shades, just giving it another kind of shot from the bottom. What's even better about this wash is that because it is an enamel-based wash, it can be reactivated with white spirit or mineral spirits if you live in the States, or probably the rest of the world. And due to the very low tension, surface tension of white spirits, it will very quickly run the wash into recesses onto models whilst leaving kind of a dirty, mucky, grimy trail. It's a fantastic method for really kind of getting that just weathered, a very good weathered effect. And this is also why we applied a varnish to the previous layers. As mineral spirits, it will quite easily strip acrylics off if you saturate the acrylic layer too much. Light and gentle application is the key here, and I can't stress that enough. You can very gently wipe off kind of some of the excess that's on the raised surfaces, either using a Q-tip, which I've seen used quite often. I'm using a jerry cloth here at the moment, and then I go in with a paintbrush a bit later. But I need to stress, you need to learn from a very big mistake I made during this project, and you might have spotted it already if you're familiar with airbrushing and white spirits. I've heard that it's a bad idea to run white spirits through an airbrush. I'd heard that it eats at the rubber gaskets that prevent the air from leaking out, but I was being impatient and I wasn't seeing too much effect for my effort at this stage. So I threw caution to the wind and I did it anyway. Big mistake. I left the piece to dry overnight, and the next morning I went to carry on painting, but nothing was coming out of the airbrush. So I thought, okay, I didn't clean it thoroughly enough the night before. So I tore it down, and just as I went to remove the nozzle on the airbrush, it snapped with zero effort whatsoever off the threads. So that airbrush was now dead. It was a cheap Chinese airbrush that I picked up off Amazon. It had served me quite well. I've had it for about 2 years now. So I figured, you know what, 20 quid, 2 years, I'm not going to get mad about that. My current theory is, like, as to why that's happened is that the metal inside the nozzle, there may have been a bit of mineral spirits still inside of there left overnight. I might not have cleaned my airbrush thoroughly the night before, and I fear that the metal reacted with the white spirit and caused it to weaken structurally. Unfortunate, but hey, what are you going to do? So I was determined to carry on whilst I waited for my new airbrush to be delivered. I took the chance to do some good old-fashioned brushwork with my wet palette. I put a mixture of Vallejo Model Colour Light Brown, which I'd used for the final layer on the general skull part of it, and I mixed in a little bit of Citadel Screaming Skull. And I started to highlight the mask with very thin, almost glaze-like layers, aiming for the raised areas of the model. So you'd be looking at the kind of the bridge of the nose, you're looking at the tops of the brows, you'd be looking at the cheekbones. That's kind of where you're aiming for. So again, top of the brows, bridge of the nose, a little bit on the chin, anywhere that's going to be catching some light, anywhere that you might have noticed took a lot of paint when you're doing your initial highlight with an airbrush. I'll be honest, I've always been a bit of a giant wuss when it comes to just good old-fashioned brushwork, glazing. And whilst I wasn't really that happy with the result as I was painting it, I persevered, I carried on, and I think ultimately it did add that kind of extra oomph to the project. It gave the skull a bit more texture, a bit more of a textured look to the bone. And so, yeah, I don't think I would have gotten that otherwise if I'd just stuck with the airbrush. So it goes to show that it's important to, you know, if you've got an airbrush, that's fine. You can complete your project entirely with an airbrush. But it's important to remember that it's just one tool out of many when it comes to this kind of a hobby. While I was happy with the result, there was still quite a few almost visible brush strokes. So to kind of hide away that, I then went over with a dry brush all across the raised areas on the skull, just to tie it all together. I used straight Screaming Skull, and I used one of the little brushes that you get if you use Elegoo resin for your 3D printing. I've noticed they started packing in 2 of those brushes into their boxes now, and I find them very handy for kind of grunt work. Whether it's applying washes to large areas, whether it's for dry brushing, they're handy little synthetic brushes that you get for free, so I'm not going to complain. Once the dry brush had well dried, I went back to my Rust Effects wash, and I also brought out AK Interactive's Winter Grime wash, which is also an enamel-based wash. I went ahead and stippled this on with one of my large brushes, and I just was aiming for around the recessed areas, so kind of inside of the brows, inside of the nose cavity, and as I went further down the model, so more kind of around the lower cheek area, around the edges, underneath the chin, I switched to the Winter Grime. That's much more of a almost greenish black, and it's good for kind of a like almost mossy effect. But yeah. And then finally, I crack over the mineral spirits once again and hit all those areas with a pretty heavy amount of it. Once again, if you're doing a lot of saturation with mineral spirits, white spirits, on top of acrylic paint, it's important to keep your movements to more of a stippling movement rather than a brushing movement. If you start brushing, then you're going to start agitating your acrylic layers and you'll start peeling off your paint job, and you don't want that. I leave it to dry, and then once it's fully dried out, I masked off the entire bony part of the mask to get ready to paint the metallics. I was still waiting for my new airbrush to be delivered, but if you're lucky enough and stick around to the end of the video, you'll get some good old-fashioned peel reveals. For the metallics, I used a Vallejo metallic gunmetal grey as a base. It's an interesting metallic, but it's also kind of I've also found it to be kind of unpredictable with its results. I tell myself every different paint has its own personality, and the personality of this one is like a cat to me. Sometimes the results are very loving and amazing, and sometimes that paint cat just knocks your paint water glass off the table. But you still can't help but love it. The result I got this time was a bit meh, not great but not terrible. This is the same paint that I used on a bust, which is going to be on the screen now, that I worked on recently, and the results feel night and day as difference. I got a very smooth finish on the bust, whereas this crown, it just I felt like I could have gotten a similar effect just using a rattle can with a rattle can silver. We then move on to washing it again, and we're going exclusively with the enamel winter grime effects. Once again, we're stippling it into the recesses with a large brush and then attacking it with white spirits. I didn't want to go too heavy with the washes. Again, one, there's no varnish on to protect the metallic in an attempt to try and keep some of the sheen, and two, even just pure white spirits on its own tends to dull down metallic finishes on acrylic paint. I then apply just some ever so small tiny highlights of Vallejo Metallic Air Aluminium in an attempt to make the metallic a bit more rough and damaged. All that's left now is to fill in the details and trimming. For the studs around the top of the crown and on the skull, I use Citadel Iron Warriors base paint. It's a great dark metal base colour, and it just gives a little bit more of a variation than just a flat steel look across the whole helmet. For the trim, I used Arteza Iridescent Fancy Black. Not a paint I'd normally use for model painting, but I picked it off Amazon a couple of months ago, looking to try a new black paint, but I actually failed to read the whole product name, not realising it was almost a black gold kind of colour, almost like a deep brass. This was by far the most time-consuming part of the project, and I did end up rushing it quite a lot because I do tend to have the attention span of a 5-year-old. For the finishing touches, I reinforced some of the shading on the metallics with an Agrax Earth shade and sanded the crystal in the middle of the crown down to a nice 2000 grit before just spraying it down with a rose gold rattle can spray paint that you can pick up at any local hardware store. I was debating printing out the crystal in a clear blue resin, but I've also ran out of overall, this was a great fun project to paint up, and I think it's important that after every project that you work on, you have an honest conversation with yourself and do a bit of a post-mortem. For me, the takeaways and the lessons learned from this project was that I was super happy with the bony bits of the mask, but that's kind of like my comfort eating when it comes to painting models. I love painting bone. I love grimy zombie skeleton bits. That's always, that's my go-to. And especially when it came to the brushwork as well, it really reinforces to me the idea of, I don't think this project's going in the right direction, but then you get to the end and you realise that it has all come together. Again, if you're not happy with how your paint job's coming along, just keep trying. And hopefully it'll turn out great at the end and you'll be happy with it, because I think that's the most important part. And yeah, I was personally dead chuffed how it all came out. With the metallics, I think I could have done it a lot more justice. The end result came across quite flat to me. I could have done some more variations with highlighting on the metallics, but ultimately that's something I'll try and tackle down the line. So what do you think? How do you think you would have done the metallic differently? Any other ways? I'm open to suggestions. Leave a comment down below. Gently press the like button, don't be too rough. And subscribe if you like this content and you'd like to see more of it. And of course, as promised, here's the peel reveal.